11 cars, a collapsed barn on a forgotten Virginia estate, and a single father in work boots who had just paid $47,000 for what everyone else in the room had decided was worthless junk. The auctioneer had barely bothered finishing the lot description. The woman in the dark coat standing near the driveway had glanced at the barn, shaken her head once, and gone back to her phone. She had people. Real appraisers. She had already looked at those cars 6 months ago and been told there was nothing there. She had believed them. She had no way of knowing that the quiet man with the grease still under his fingernails had spent 20 years seeing things that other appraisers walked right past. She had no way of knowing what he had recognized the moment he stepped through that barn door. What happened next at Hartwell Manor would change the collector world forever. Stay with me to the end. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. The Hartwell estate sat on 80 acres of Blue Ridge farmland that the last of the Hartwell family had stopped caring for sometime around 1990. You could see it in the fence lines, the timber long past needing to come down. The main house still standing but barely, its porch sagging, its windows dark. Beyond it, 5 outbuildings, 2 barns, a carriage house, a machine shed, and a low stone building that had once been a smokehouse. The estate sale had drawn 41 registered bidders. Most of them were here for the house. A few were here for the land. Dean Marsh was here for the barns. He had driven 4 hours from his shop in Buena Vista, left at 3 in the morning, stopped once for gas and a cup of coffee that had gone cold before he finished it. Rosie was with Frank's wife, Carol. Rosie was 8. She didn't know why her father had driven 4 hours in the dark. He hadn't told her much, because he didn't want to promise her something he couldn't yet guarantee. He had learned, after 8 years of raising her alone, that the best way to protect her was to wait until something was certain before he said it out loud. He parked at the edge of the gravel lot and walked straight to the barns. He had an hour before bidding started. He wanted every minute. The main barn doors were padlocked, but the estate attorney had given registered bidders access the day before. Dean had the padlock key on his ring. He unlocked the first door and stepped inside. The air was cold and smelled like old oil and dry wood and the specific stillness of a space that had not been disturbed in a long time. He stood in the doorway for a moment, let his eyes adjust. Then he started counting. There were shapes under tarps. Some of them were obvious. The flat, boxy profile of a pickup truck. The rounded back end of a wagon. He moved past those. He was not here for the obvious things. In the carriage house behind the main barn, he found them. 8 more shapes. Tarps, some of them rotted, some of them still holding. He moved quietly. He did not rush. He crouched beside the nearest one and lifted the corner of the tarp. Looked at the wheel arch. At the spoke pattern on the wheel. At the way the fender curved. He set the tarp down. He did not react. That was important. He had learned early in his years as an appraiser that the moment you reacted, you were already at a disadvantage. He moved to the next one. Then the next. He saved the one in the far corner for last. It was the smallest shape in the room, set back in the shadows, half covered by a tarp that had partially collapsed under decades of dust. The only reason someone would skip it was if they weren't looking for what it was. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he walked back out into the cold Virginia morning, got his clipboard, and wrote some numbers. He wrote them small, in the margin, where nobody would see them. He went back inside and waited for the bidding to start. The auction started at 9. Lot 1 was the main house and its immediate grounds. The bidding opened at $300,000 and climbed fast. Dean stood at the back of the gravel lot with his clipboard and watched. The woman in the dark coat was the one bidding on the house. She had a phone in each hand and a man in a gray suit beside her, who whispered occasionally and got nothing but a nod in return. Her name was on the registration sheet. Dean had seen it at check-in. Vivienne Cole. He knew the name. Most people in the collector world did. She had bought 8 significant cars in the past 3 years, all of them documented, cataloged, and transferred to a climate-controlled facility in Charlottesville. She was assembling something. He didn't know exactly what. But people who bought cars the way she did always had an end in mind. She won the house at $420,000. Didn't smile. Just marked something on her phone and moved on. Lot 7 came up mid-morning. Outbuildings and contents. The auctioneer described it in 15 seconds. 2 barns, 1 carriage house, 1 machine shed, and contents therein. He said the word contents the way people say the word etc. Like it was a footnote, like it barely mattered. Nobody raised a paddle for the first 10 seconds. Dean raised his. A man in a work vest bid against him briefly. Stopped at $30,000. Dean bid $47,000. Nobody else moved. The auctioneer's gavel came down before the echo of the number was gone. He was packing his clipboard when Vivian Cole walked past. She slowed, looked at him, then at the barns. "You know those cars are worthless," she said. It was not unkind. It was the tone of someone correcting a minor misunderstanding before it became an embarrassing problem. "I had an appraiser go through every vehicle on this property 6 months ago. Nothing there worth what you just paid. Nothing significant." Dean looked at her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate you letting me know." She looked at him for another second. Then she nodded, once, and walked toward her car. The man in the gray suit followed. Neither of them looked back. Dean stood on the gravel and listened to them drive away. Then he went to get the keys to the padlocks. He did not call Frank until he was back inside the carriage house with the doors closed. Frank had been his boss for 11 years. Before that, Frank had been in the car restoration business for 2 decades. He knew what things were worth, not at Dean's level, but enough to understand when Dean said a number. "You sure?" Frank said, when Dean told him what he was looking at. "No." Dean said, "But I've been close to sure before, and I've never been wrong in a carriage house." Frank was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need?" "I need you to drive out here Saturday. Bring the flatbed. And bring your camera." The thing about Dean Marsh was that he did not look like what he was. He looked like a mechanic. Because he was a mechanic. He drove a truck with 180,000 miles on it. He wore the same 3 flannels in rotation. He lived in a rental house in Buena Vista, Virginia, that had a yard Rosie liked, and a furnace that worked most of the time. He charged fair rates and did good work, and most of his customers had been coming back for 15 years because he was honest and because he was better than the dealership and cost half as much. What his customers did not know was what he had been before Buena Vista. From the time he was 22 until the year Rosie was born, Dean Marsh had worked as an automotive appraiser for one of the 3 major auction houses in the country. Not as a junior cataloger or a researcher, as a senior authenticator. The person they sent when a car's provenance was in question, when 2 buyers were fighting over a number, when something extraordinary arrived and they needed someone who could tell the difference between a genuine article and a very convincing restoration. He was the best at it, not by a little. He had a specific gift that he could not fully explain and had never tried to. He could look at a car, even a covered one, even a silent one in a dark barn, and understand its identity. Something in the proportions, the weight of the lines, the specific curve of a fender, or the exact radius of a wheel arch. He had been right about things that other people had written off, and wrong about nothing significant in 15 years of doing it. He had walked away from that job the year Rosie was born, because her mother had died, and someone had to be home. He did not regret that, not once. But he had kept the knowledge. That never left him. It sat in his hands, quiet, available, waiting for the moment it was needed. The barns at Hartwell had needed it. He had known within 30 minutes of walking through that carriage house door. The $47,000 he had paid was not a risk. It was a calculation. He had run the numbers on the drive home, one hand on the wheel, the radio off, Rosie still 200 miles away at Frank's house. He had been conservative. He had not counted the Ferrari yet, because you did not count something like that until you had Otto Heiser's eyes on it and his name on a document. But even without the Ferrari, the number was not small. He drove home with his hands steady and his mind running very quietly through everything that still needed to happen. Authentication, transport, documentation, storage, and before any of that, making sure his $47,000 was attached to every car in that carriage house by a paper trail that no one could dispute. He called Patricia Ward from the highway. She was an estate attorney in Staunton, recommended by a client of Frank's. He had met her once, briefly, when she handled a title issue on a truck he'd sold. She answered on the second ring. "I just won Lot 7 at the Hartwell estate sale," he said. "All contents of the outbuildings." "Yes," she said, "I can pull up the lot description tonight." "Did you need it for title documentation?" "I need something more specific than the lot description," he said. "I need every vehicle on that property photographed and tied to the lot before Saturday. Can you get me documentation that assigns each one to Lot 7? She asked a few questions. He answered them. She said she would pull the original estate inventory and match it against the lot description. 2 days later, she called him back. "There's one vehicle that's listed as a carriage house item in the original estate inventory," she said. "But the lot description uses the phrase outbuildings and contents, which by county real estate convention includes all attached structures." She paused. "It's airtight. But I'm going to have it formally confirmed by the estate's attorney of record, just so there's no ambiguity." Dean thanked her. He went back to work. Changed brake pads on a Chevy pickup, replaced a water pump on an old Volvo, did an alignment on a minivan. Normal day. Everything normal. He did not tell anyone except Frank and Patricia. He did not tell Rosie. He had driven past the Hartwell estate once before the sale, about a month before. He hadn't gone in. He had just slowed on the county road and looked at the roof of the main house over the tree line and thought about what a piece of property like that collected over the years when nobody was paying attention. Old estates did that. They became repositories, not by design, just because people kept things, and things accumulated, and then the person who kept them died. And then the person after them died, and eventually a building was full of the decades of a family's life, and nobody left who knew what any of it was. He had grown up around that kind of accumulation. His uncle's shop had been near an estate sale circuit in the Shenandoah Valley. Every summer, properties would come up. His uncle would take him to look. Not to buy, just to look, and to learn. His uncle had the same gift, to a lesser degree. Could walk into a space and read it. Could tell within 20 minutes whether it was worth staying. He had stayed 20 minutes at the Hartwell barn door that first visit. Then he had gone back to his truck and called Frank and said, "I'm going to the sale." Frank had said, "How sure are you?" He had said, 70%. Frank had said, "You've never been 70% and been wrong." He had said, "First time for everything." There hadn't been. The appraiser Vivienne had sent, whoever it had been, had probably spent an hour in the barns. Dean had spent 4 hours before the bidding started, and he'd come back for more. He did not know if the other appraiser had been careless or rushed or simply unlucky in the particular way of missing something, because your eyes arrived at it already decided. It didn't matter now. The only thing that mattered was what was there. He thought about his uncle sometimes. His uncle had died when Dean was 25. Before the auction house career, before everything, he had not seen the best of what Dean would do. Dean thought about that occasionally, about the things you do that the people who taught you don't get to see, about how that was all right. The teaching was the gift, and the gift had been given, and what you did with it afterward belonged to you. He had not planned to tell Rosie about the surgery this way. He had been waiting for a good moment, a calm Saturday morning maybe, with the right words already organized. but she had found the clipboard. She was 8. She got into everything. She found it on the kitchen table, under a pile of mail he'd meant to sort. She didn't understand most of what was written on it. But she understood numbers. She was good at numbers. Her teacher said so. So she read the numbers on the clipboard, and she brought it to him in the kitchen, and she said, in the careful voice she used when she was working something out, "Dad, why does it say $340,000 next to my name?" He turned off the stove. He sat down at the kitchen table across from her. He looked at her face, which was his wife's face in the way that faces pass between generations without asking permission. Dark eyes, a serious mouth, the specific expression of a person who already knows the conversation is going to matter and is ready for it. "Tell me what you already know," he said. She thought about it. "I know my heart has a thing in it. I know I had an operation when I was a baby. I know, doctor. Reyes checks it every year." She looked at the clipboard. "I know we don't have $340,000. "No," he said. "We don't. Not right now. Do I need another operation?" He had asked Dr. Reyes if there was a gentle way to explain it to a child. Dr. Reyes had said the gentle way was the honest way. Children handled honesty better than adults expected. What they didn't handle well was finding out later that someone had been soft about the truth. "The thing in your heart," Dean said, "the one they fixed before you were old enough to know about it, it's grown with you. Most of the time that's fine. But Dr. Reyes thinks there's about a 70% chance you're going to need them to go back in and adjust it. Not immediately, maybe not for a year, but before it becomes a bigger problem." Rosie sat with that. He could see her processing it, the way she tilted her head slightly when she was doing real thinking. "And it costs $340,000, she said, with the insurance gap." "Yeah," she looked at the clipboard again. "You went to get money for it." He had not explained the estate to her in those terms. He had said he was looking at something he thought might be worth buying. He had not told her how much was riding on it. "Yeah," he said, "that's part of it." "What's the other part?" He thought about how to say it. Rosie had a way of asking the exact question that required the most precise answer. She had been doing it since she was 4. "When I was younger," he said, "before you were born, I used to be able to look at old cars and tell what they were worth." Not everybody could do that. It's like hearing something in music that other people miss. I had that. And I thought maybe one of those cars at that estate had something worth finding. Did it? I think so. But I don't know for certain yet. He put his hand over the clipboard. "So I don't want you to count on it yet." "Okay," she said. That was it. Just okay. She didn't press him. She got up and took her bowl of cereal to the couch and turned on the television. He sat at the table for another minute and listened to the program she was watching, something with animals, and thought about what it meant to raise a child who trusted you that completely. He thought about the shape in the corner of the carriage house, under the collapsed tarp. He thought about what it would mean if he was wrong. He had been dealing with Rosie's heart since before she could walk. The first surgery had been when she was 11 months old. He and his wife had held each other in the hospital corridor for 6 hours, while a surgeon he'd met twice rebuilt something inside his daughter that was supposed to be perfect, but wasn't. His wife had been healthy, completely healthy. And 2 months after Rosie's surgery, she had died in a car accident on a clear afternoon in March, 17 minutes from home. Dean had learned in that period, the period that covered his daughter's heart surgery and his wife's death, and every terrible week afterward, that grief and fear occupied the same space in him. He could not separate them. And the only thing that helped either one was work. Concrete, specific, solvable work. Something in front of him with a clear answer if he paid enough attention. Cars had always given him that. Since he was 17, working weekends at his uncle's shop. The engine had a logic. The body had a truth to it. You could read it if you knew how to look. He had built his whole adult life around that skill, and then he had set it down to raise his daughter, and now he needed it back. "Doctor, Reyes had been direct at the last appointment. The mitral valve repair from the first surgery was holding. But as Rosie grew, the repaired valve was not growing with her at the right rate. It was working, but it was working harder than it should. Another 2 years and the strain would become significant. Better to address it while she was young and while the repair would be straightforward. Straightforward, Dean had repeated. As much as anything in the chest is, the doctor had said, which was not exactly comforting, but was honest. $340,000. After insurance. After everything Dean had already set aside, which was $28,000 in a savings account he had not touched in 3 years. He needed $312,000 more. His shop didn't make that kind of money. Not in a year. Not in 3 years. Frank had offered to help when Dean told him about the estimate. Frank had said, "Whatever you need." Dean had said, "I know." He had said it the way you say something when you know the person means it and you also know you are not going to take it. He was not going to lean on Frank. Frank had his own family, his own costs, his own future to protect. He was not going to pass this problem to someone else. He was going to solve it himself, the way he had always solved hard things. By looking carefully at what was actually in front of him and finding the thing everyone else had walked past. That Saturday, Frank drove out in the flatbed. They opened the carriage house doors in the early morning, before anyone else was on the property. And Frank stood in the threshold and looked at the shapes under the tarps and said, "Dean." "Yeah, tell me what I'm looking at." Dean walked him through each one. Not the Ferrari yet. The others first. He lifted the corner of a tarp and showed Frank the gullowing door mechanism on the Mercedes. He showed him the rear haunch of the Duesenberg, the spoke wheels on the Porsche. He said the numbers quietly. Frank stood beside him and nodded and did not say much, because Frank knew enough to understand when a number was real. When they got to the far corner, Dean paused. "That one," Frank said. "That's the one, isn't it?" "I think so." "How sure?" Very. Frank took pictures of everything. Every car. Every VIN plate he could reach without disturbing anything. Every corner of the carriage house. Dean made notes on his clipboard. They worked quietly for 3 hours. Methodical. No hurry. Getting everything documented before anything moved. When they were done, Dean pulled out his phone and called Otto Heiser. Otto was 74 years old and lived 40 minutes away in Charlottesville. He had been the chief automotive historian at the Smithsonian's Transportation Collection before he retired, and before that he had spent 30 years authenticating significant vehicles for the major auction houses. He and Dean had worked together for most of Dean's career. They had spoken on the phone a dozen times since Dean had left the industry. They had not talked about anything significant. "This will be significant," Dean said. Otto was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When?" Dean said, "Next week if you're able." Otto said, "I'll drive out Monday." He had talked to Dr. Reyes about the timeline honestly. She had been Dean's doctor too, in a way, since the first surgery. She had sat with him in the hallway outside the NICU when Rosie was 11 months old and explained what the procedure involved, and she had said it with the kind of directness that Dean trusted, because it never dressed things in better clothes than they deserved. He still remembered every word of that first conversation. He kept it in a specific place in his memory, not because it was the worst moment, because it was the moment he understood what the stakes were, and when you understood the stakes clearly, you could work. He had always been able to work under stakes. He had been built for it. His father had been a man who went quiet when things got hard, and Dean had grown up watching that and deciding to be the opposite. The person who moved toward the difficult thing rather than away from it. Not recklessly, just steadily. The way you approached a car that wasn't running, you got underneath it. You looked at what was actually there. You didn't guess. The mitral valve repair had been the first hard thing. His wife's death had been the second, and the worst of the two, and there was no fixing that one, only carrying it. Rosie had been 3 months past her surgery when the accident happened. She had been too young to remember either the surgery or losing her mother. That part was mercy. The part that wasn't mercy was that she would spend her whole life growing up knowing a loss she couldn't remember in any specific way, just the shape of the absence. Dean had tried to fill that shape with presence. He had never missed a school event. He had never been unreachable. He was not a man who expressed things in large gestures, but he was a man who showed up. And he had shown up for 8 years, and Rosie knew it the way children know the things that are true. She trusted him. That was the weight he carried to every decision, not just the medical one, every one. On the morning Frank drove out with the flatbed, Dean had been at the carriage house since 6. He had gone through each vehicle again, more carefully, with a flashlight and his clipboard. He moved slowly. He did not rush. He verified each thing he had noted on the first visit. He wrote corrected numbers beside the original ones. The 5 significant vehicles were exactly what he had thought. The 6 ordinary ones were exactly what they were. 2 1960s pickup trucks, a 1953 station wagon, a farm tractor, a riding mower that had rusted into permanent retirement, and a 1974 Dodge van that had once apparently been painted orange and was now the color of old regret. He photographed all of them, the significant and the ordinary. He wanted a record of what was actually there, what he had actually purchased for $47,000. Not because he was going to show it to anyone, because accurate documentation was what he knew how to do, and he did not have a category for cutting corners on it. Frank arrived at 8. They started at the far end of the carriage house and worked toward the corner. Frank took pictures with the shop's camera, every car from every angle, every VIN he could read, every detail that might matter. He did not say much. He was 61 years old and had seen a lot of cars in his life, and he knew when something was different. He didn't need Dean to explain it. When they reached the corner, Frank stood next to Dean in front of the covered shape and looked at it for a long time. He said, "You sure you want to wait for Otto?" Dean said, "Yes." Frank said, "Okay." They drove back to Buena Vista. Frank's truck smelled like the beef jerky he kept in the cup holder and the coffee that had spilled on the dash 2 years ago and never fully came out. Dean rode with his elbow on the window ledge and watched the Blue Ridge pass by. Frank said, "What if Otto disagrees?" Dean said, "He won't." Frank said, "But what if?" Dean said, "Then I'm wrong. I've been wrong before." He looked at the mountain line. "About cars, I've been wrong twice, in 22 years. Frank said, "About other things?" Dean said, "Yeah, about other things. Plenty of times." Frank drove. The radio was on low. Something with a fiddle in it. Frank said, "You're not wrong about this one." Dean said, "I know." Word got out. It always did. The collector world was small. Everyone knew everyone. Someone at the auction had recognized Dean's name on the registration list. Someone else had heard about Lot 7. A third person had mentioned, over coffee at a car show in Roanoke, that a mechanic from Buena Vista had bought the Hartwell Estate outbuildings for $47,000 and was being real quiet about what was in them. By the 3rd week, Dean had received 4 emails, 2 phone calls, and a handwritten letter asking if any of the vehicles were available for sale. He did not respond to any of them. He responded to Otto. Otto Heiser had arrived at Hartwell on a Monday morning, wearing a wax jacket and carrying a case of tools that had been with him since 1981. He was a short man, thin, with white hair and the kind of patient, precise movements that came from 50 years of handling things that mattered. He did not say much when he came in. He put on his glasses and he started looking. He looked for 4 hours. Dean stood near the door and waited. He had learned, working alongside Otto, that the worst thing you could do during an authentication was hover. You gave the man his space. You let him do what he did. You waited. At noon, Otto came out of the carriage house and stood in the cold air. He took off his glasses. He cleaned them with a cloth. He put them back on. Then he looked at Dean. His expression was completely flat, Guito, Otto said. Chassis number 3987 GT. He paused. I'm going to need 2 weeks to confirm the full provenance, but you can proceed on the assumption that this is what it appears to be. Dean said, Okay. Otto said Dean. Dean said, I know. You understand what I'm telling you. I understand. And you're all right? Dean thought about Rosie at school, probably working on a math worksheet, wearing the red hoodie she refused to take off. He thought about the number on the clipboard, the number next to her name. I'm all right, he said. Otto looked at him for a moment. Then he went back inside. A 1963 Ferrari 250 Gito was the most valuable production car ever built. 39 had been made. Each one had competed at the highest level of motorsport in its era. Le Mans, the Targa Florio, the Tour de France automobile. In the decades since, they had passed through the hands of collectors, museums, private dynasties. The last one to sell at public auction had sold for $70 million, $400,000 in 2018. The ones that had not sold at auction were worth the same or more. Chassis 3987 GT had not been documented since 1974, when it had disappeared from the Italian collector records. Where it had been in the half-century since was a question that automotive historians had occasionally asked without finding an answer. The answer, it turned out, was a carriage house in Rockbridge County, Virginia, under a rotted tarp that nobody had bothered to lift. Otto's full report would take 2 weeks. Dean's $47,000 was about to become something that did not have a comfortable number to put beside it. Not yet. He did not rush. He went back to the shop. He worked on cars. He changed oil and replaced timing belts and fixed a transmission that had been making a noise its owner described as like, something's unhappy in there. He ate dinner with Rosie. He helped her with homework. He read to her at bedtime a chapter book about a girl who could talk to animals, which Rosie had opinions about in the way she had opinions about most things. He did not tell her about the Guido. On the 3rd week, Vivian Cole called his shop. He was under a truck when Frank came to get him. Dean slid out, wiped his hands. Frank held the phone out with a look that said, This is the one from the auction. Dean took it. Miss Cole, he said. Her voice was exactly what he expected, clear and direct, no small talk. Mr. Marsh, I understand you're holding some vehicles from the Hartwell estate. I'd like to make an offer on the collection. Which vehicles specifically? He said. All of them, as a lot. Her pause was brief. I'm prepared to offer $200,000. That's more than 4 times what you paid 3 weeks ago. He let a beat pass. Thank you for calling, he said. But I'm not ready to sell. Another pause. A different quality this time. The pause of someone recalculating. I'd like to discuss this further, she said. In person, perhaps. I'll let you know if that changes, he said. He handed the phone back to Frank and went back under the truck. Frank waited for him to come out again before he said anything. When he did, he said, $200,000. Yeah, Dean said. That's a lot of money. It is. You didn't take it. No, Frank looked at him. Then he nodded. All right. Frank did not ask more questions. That was one of the things Dean valued most about Frank. He understood when a thing was decided and when it wasn't, and he knew the difference between them. Vivian called again the following Monday. She offered $400,000 for the lot. Dean said he wasn't ready to sell. She said, Is there a number that would make you ready? He said, Not right now. She said, Mr. Marsh, I've been collecting significant vehicles for 9 years. I know what I'm looking at. Or what I may be looking at. She said the last part carefully, like she was choosing the words. I'd rather conduct a transaction than a negotiation. Dean said, I understand. When I'm ready to sell, I'll reach out. He ended the call. Vivienne's 3rd call never came. What came instead was a letter. It arrived at his shop on a Wednesday, in an envelope from a law firm in Charlottesville. Registered mail. His name on the front in block letters. He opened it at the counter. The letter was 4 pages. The language was precise and technical and boiled down to one thing. There was a dispute over the legal assignment of one vehicle. A vehicle described only as a certain automobile located in the attached carriage house structure, the lot assignment of which is contested on grounds that the carriage house was not explicitly enumerated in the lot description for Lot 7, and may constitute an attached improvement to the main residential lot, Lot 1. They were claiming the carriage house was not part of Lot 7. They were claiming the car in the carriage house belonged to the buyer of the main lot, which was Vivienne Cole. He read the letter 3 times. Then he called Patricia Ward. She answered on the second ring. He read her the relevant section. She was quiet for a long time. She said, "Send me the full letter." He scanned it that afternoon. She called him back at 6 in the evening. "This is aggressive," Patricia said. "Not unprecedented, but aggressive. The argument hinges on whether the carriage house qualifies as an outbuilding under the county's real estate code. In most cases, a freestanding carriage house would clearly be an outbuilding. But this one shares a foundation wall with the main house structure, which gives her attorney an arguable hook." Dean said, "What do we do?" Patricia said, "We counter immediately. I have your lot documentation, the estate inventory, and the photographs Frank took. We argue that the county code's definition of outbuilding encompasses attached structures when the primary function is non-residential storage, which the carriage house is." Dean said, "How strong is our position?" "Very strong," Patricia said. "But this will take time. And in the meantime," she paused, "in the meantime, you cannot move, sell, or restore the vehicle in question." Dean said, "How long?" She said, 4 to 6 weeks, if we're efficient. Could be longer if they push back." He was quiet. Patricia said, "Dean." He said, "I know." She said, 4 weeks is not forever." He said, "I know that too." He hung up. He sat in the chair behind the service desk, in the quiet of the shop after Frank had gone home, and looked at the wall calendar. He thought about Dr. Reyes's recommendation. He thought about the window she had described for the surgery. He thought about what 4 or 6 weeks meant in the sequence of things that needed to happen before Rosie went into that operating room. He thought about the letter, about the argument that a carriage house sharing a foundation wall was not an outbuilding. It was a legal argument with some technical weight. He had to give her that. It was not a dishonest argument. It was the kind of argument you made when you had already tried offering money and it hadn't worked, and you needed another approach. He understood it. He didn't like it, but he understood it. He locked up the shop and drove home. Rosie was at the kitchen table doing homework. She looked up when he came in. "You look tired," she said. He looked at his daughter. She was sitting in the kitchen light with a pencil in her hand and the specific patient expression of someone who had asked a real question and was waiting for a real answer. "Long day," he said. She nodded and went back to her homework. He made dinner. Something simple. Pasta from a box, because it was late and she needed to eat and he didn't have the concentration for anything more. They ate. She told him about school. He listened. After she was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table and called Frank. "I need to talk to you," he said. Frank said, "I'll come in early." They met at 7 the next morning, before any customers, with coffee from the machine that Frank had fixed himself, and that made better coffee than it had any right to. Dean laid it out. The letter, the legal angle, Patricia's assessment, the timeline. Frank listened without interrupting. When Dean was finished, Frank drank his coffee and looked at the wall. 4 to 6 weeks, Frank said. That's the estimate. Frank said, "Patricia's good. She's the best one I found." Frank nodded. Then he said, "What's the counter?" "Patricia files today," Dean said. "We have the photographs. We have the estate inventory, which lists the carriage house contents separately from the main house contents. We have the lot description, which says outbuildings and contents in language that's clear to anyone who reads plain English. She's got a technical argument. We have the facts. Frank said, an Otto's report comes in Monday. How's that going to look? Like what it is, Dean said. Frank almost smiled. He said, all right then, we wait. Dean said, we wait. He went back to work. He changed a fan belt. He diagnosed a coolant leak. He did an inspection on a car that turned out to need more work than its owner wanted to hear about, which he told them straight, because that was how he did things. He did not rush anything. He did not skip steps. He worked the way he always worked. Rosie came by after school that day. She did sometimes. Sat in the shop and watched, or read, or did homework in the waiting area while he finished up. She liked the smell of the shop. She had told him that once, which was one of those things children said that stayed with you. When Frank came to say goodbye for the day, he stopped by the waiting area. He said something to Rosie that Dean couldn't hear. Rosie laughed. Frank ruffled her hair in a way she normally objected to, but apparently accepted from Frank. When Frank was gone, Rosie came to find Dean at his bay. Frank says hi, she reported. He was just here, Dean said. I know. She watched him wipe down a wrench. She said, Dad, is everything going to be okay? He looked at her. He thought about the letter in the desk, about Patricia Ward, about Otto Heiser and what his report would say on Monday. He thought about the shape in the corner of the carriage house. Yeah, he said. I think so. She looked at him a moment. Okay, she said, and went back to her book. He thought about her appraiser, the one she had sent to Hartwell 6 months before the estate sale. He did not know who it had been. It didn't matter who it had been. What had happened was clear enough without a name attached. Someone had walked through the carriage house, seen a row of tarp-covered shapes, made a judgment about what they were likely to be without doing the work of finding out what they actually were, and written a report that said nothing significant. That happened. It happened more than people in the industry like to admit. A significant car in a barn was the last thing most appraisers expected to find, which made them less likely to look for one. You saw what you expected to see. That was the hazard of expertise deployed without attention. Dean had spent his career doing the opposite. He had trained himself, consciously and early, to walk into every situation assuming nothing, to look at what was actually there rather than what was likely to be there. It was a discipline, not a talent. Something he had built, deliberately, through years of being wrong when he assumed, and right when he looked. The appraiser Vivienne had sent had assumed. Dean had looked. That was the whole story, really. The $47,000, the $47 million GTO, all of it. The difference between those two numbers was the difference between assuming and looking. The second call from Vivienne had come on a Wednesday. Frank had taken it at the front desk. He'd walked back to where Dean was replacing a strut on a sedan and said, "It's her again." Dean had come out. He had taken the phone. The offer was $400,000 for the entire collection. He had looked at the wall calendar. He had looked at the coffee stain on his work shirt. He had said, "I'm not ready to sell." She had said, "I want you to understand what I'm offering. $400,000 is a significant premium over what you paid." He had said, "I understand. And I'm not ready to sell." She had said, "What would make you ready?" He had said, "Time, probably." She had said, "How much time?" He had said, "I don't know yet." The silence on the other end had been brief and deliberate, the silence of someone recalculating. She had said, "I'd like to understand what you're looking at in those barns." My appraiser said. He had said, "I know what your appraiser said." Another silence. She said, "Mister, Marsh, I've been collecting significant vehicles for 9 years. I know this estate better than most people. If there is something in those barns that my appraiser missed, I would like the opportunity to discuss it with you directly. He had said, I understand that, and when I'm ready to have that conversation, I'll reach out. He had handed the phone back to Frank and gone back to the strut. Frank had stood in the bay door for a moment. Frank had said, she's smart. Dean had said, she is. Frank had said, and she knows she missed something. Dean had said, she knew something was off as soon as I didn't take the first offer. He had picked up the wrench. She just doesn't know how much. He had finished the strut. He had done 3 more jobs before closing time. He had locked up and driven home and made dinner and helped Rosie with reading comprehension worksheets she had opinions about. He had slept 6 hours. The next morning, he had done it again. The shop was good for that. It had its own rhythm. Customers came and went. Problems arrived with names already on them. The water pump on the Volvo, the alignment on the Jeep, the exhaust on the old Chevy that one of the high school teachers drove. He knew most of his customers by first name. He knew their cars the way he knew the cars at Hartwell, in the specific, accumulated way of someone who had paid attention over a long time. His father had told him once that the only thing better than knowing things was being known. He had said it when Dean was maybe 14, which was the last year they had talked easily before things between them went complicated. Dean had not thought about it in years. He thought about it in the shop, sometimes, when a customer came in who he'd been servicing since before Rosie was born. When someone handed him their keys without worry, without checking the estimate twice, without asking if he was sure. That was something. It was not $94 million, but it was something real. Otto's report arrived Monday morning, not by email, by hand. Otto drove out to the shop himself, which he had not said he was going to do. He arrived at 8:30, parked his car carefully in the lot, came inside and shook Frank's hand and accepted a cup of coffee. He sat down across from Dean at the desk. He set the report on the table between them. It was 11 pages, single-spaced. Otto's handwriting on the cover in blue ink. Hartwell Estate. Vehicle Authentication Report. O. Heiser, the date. The full provenance, Otto said, is confirmed. He folded his hands. Chassis 3987 GT was delivered to the Italian market in January 1963. It competed in the 1963 Targa Florio and the 1963 Tour de France Automobile, where it placed second overall. In 1967, it was sold to a private collector in Florence. The trail goes quiet after 1974. He tapped the report. I have spent the past 2 weeks tracing the ownership chain through Italian estate records, FIA homologation documents, and 2 private family archives. The Hartwell family purchased it in 1974 through a Geneva intermediary. The documentation is complete. He looked at Dean. It is 3987 GT. There is no question. Dean said, all right. Otto said, Dean, the last recorded auction price for a Jetta was $70,400,000. That was in 2018, 7 years ago. The market for these vehicles has not gone backward. He paused. I would not advise going to auction below $985, possibly higher. Frank said, from the corner where he had been standing very still, $985 million. Otto looked at him. Approximately, yes. Frank sat down. Dean looked at the report. He thought about $47,000. He thought about the auctioneer's gavel. He thought about what Vivienne Cole had said, standing in the gravel lot. Nothing there. Nothing significant. He thought about $340,000 for Rosie's surgery. He thought about $95 million. He could not quite hold both numbers in the same thought. They did not fit together in any ordinary framework he had available to him. He set that aside. He had learned, in the harder years, that the mind's difficulty accommodating good news was not a reason to distrust the news. It was just how good news arrived, sometimes too large to hold at first. You understand this changes the property dispute, Otto said. How? Frank asked. Dean said, Vivian Cole's attorney is arguing the carriage house might belong to Lot 1, but the argument was filed without knowing what was in the carriage house. Now we know. Otto nodded. Once this report is in Patricia Ward's hands, the legal posture changes completely. The other side will know what they've argued themselves into claiming. If they win the property dispute, they win a $95 million vehicle for $420,000, which is what Ms. Cole paid for the house. That's not going to happen, Dean said. No, it's not. Otto looked at him. Because the documentation is complete, the chain of title is clear, and Patricia Ward is going to file in circuit court before that firm's attorneys even have a chance to request discovery. He set his coffee down. I took the liberty of emailing the report to Patricia last night. She called me this morning at 7. She said to tell you the counterfiling is ready. She needed the report. She has it now. Dean said, Thank you. Otto said, Don't thank me. I've wanted to find 3987 GT since I was 43 years old. He almost smiled. This is better than most things I expected to happen at 74. They sat in the shop for a while. The coffee got cold. Outside, a truck pulled in for an oil change, and Frank went to deal with it, because the shop still had to run. Dean stayed at the desk with Otto's report in front of him. He called Patricia. She had filed the counter. The argument was straightforward. Lot 7 explicitly covered all outbuildings and their contents. The county's real estate code defined outbuildings as structures on the property used for purposes other than primary residential habitation. The carriage house, regardless of its foundation attachment to the main structure, was documented in the original estate inventory as a storage facility for vehicles and equipment, not residential, not part of Lot 1. Lot 7. Dean Marsh's property. She expected the opposing counsel to review the counter, consult with their client, and make a decision within the week. Dean said, What's their decision likely to be? Patricia said, If they're being advised correctly, they'll withdraw. The documentation is too strong. Continuing would be expensive, slow, and likely to result in a public record that describes their client as having attempted to legally take a $95 million asset from a single father in a county courthouse in Rockbridge County, Virginia. She paused. That is not a story anyone wants attached to their name. Dean said, And if they're not being advised correctly? Then we go to circuit court and we win, Patricia said. It will take longer, but we'll win. He thanked her and hung up. He went back to work. The days that followed had a particular quality, not anxious exactly, more like the days before a weather system arrives, when you know it's coming and you've done what can be done, and now there's nothing left but to wait for it. He serviced vehicles. He talked to customers. He picked Rosie up from school. He made dinners that were better than pasta from a box when he had the energy, and pasta from a box when he didn't, and Rosie ate both with equal enthusiasm and no complaints. He took her to her monthly appointment with Dr. Reyes. Dr. Reyes listened to Rosie's heart. She had Rosie run on a short treadmill for 3 minutes and then listened again. She reviewed the most recent imaging. She told Rosie she was doing great, which Rosie accepted with the calm of someone who had been told this many times and had decided it was probably true. In the hallway after, Dr. Reyes spoke to Dean. No change, she said. She's holding steady. But I want to have the surgical consult done within the next 6 months, so we can plan the procedure date. She looked at him. How are we doing on the financial piece? We're working on it, Dean said. She nodded. The hospital's financial assistance team can extend the payment timeline if needed, but the full amount will need to be committed before the procedure is scheduled. I understand, Dean said. He drove home in the quiet. Rosie fell asleep in the passenger seat before they were 5 miles from the hospital. The highway was dark and straight. He drove with one hand and the radio off. He thought about what holding steady meant. About 6 months. About the procedure date. He thought about Patricia's counterfiling, which had been in the hands of the opposing counsel for 4 days now. On a Thursday afternoon, Patricia called. He was in the shop parking lot, about to go back in. "They're withdrawing," she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. She said, "The letter came this morning. They've conceded the lot assignment. All 11 vehicles are legally and unambiguously Dean Marsh's property." He said, "All 11. All 11. He leaned against his truck. The late afternoon light was coming in at a low angle, the way it did in the valley in autumn, gold and definite. A hawk was circling something out beyond the fence line. He said, "Thank you, Patricia." She said, "Don't mention it." She paused. "Congratulations, I think you know what you have." He said, "I'm beginning to." He sat in his truck for a while before going back inside. He called Frank. He gave Frank the news in 3 sentences. Frank was quiet for a moment and then said, "You know what you need to do next." "I know." "Have you thought about who?" "One house," Dean said. "I know who they are." There was one auction house he trusted absolutely. He had worked with them for 12 years. He knew their chief specialist for American and European collector vehicles by name. He called her that afternoon. Her name was Renata Schultz, and she was the most careful person in the business, and she did not get excited easily. When Dean finished laying out what he had, each car, the authentication, the report, she was quiet for several seconds. "Dean," she said. "Yeah, the goodo. You're certain of the provenance?" "Otto Heiser," Dean said. 11 pages. Every document back to the factory in Maranello. Another silence. She said, "I need to see it myself before we set a date. But if Otto says it's 3987 GT, then it's 3987 GT. She paused. "I want to come out this week. Friday," he said. She arrived at Hartwell on a Friday morning with 2 colleagues. They were in the carriage house for 6 hours. Dean waited outside. He had learned, working alongside people like Renata and Otto, that what happened during an authentication was almost never the dramatic moment. It was the quiet afterward that carried the weight. When Renata came out, she stood in the cold Virginia air and looked at him for a moment without speaking. "You need an auction date," she said. He said, "I know." She said, "Give me 90 days to catalog, promote, and set the floor." "We do this right, Dean. We only do this once." She looked back at the carriage house. "This is the most significant barn find since," she stopped herself. "Since a long time." She looked at him. "Do you understand what's going to happen when this becomes public?" "I have some idea. The press is going to be significant. Your name is going to be attached to this permanently." "That's all right." She studied him. She said, "Why'd you buy it? What made you go to that auction?" He thought about Rosie in the waiting room at the hospital, about the number on the clipboard, about the shapes under tarps in the early morning dark. "I needed to," he said. She held his gaze a moment. Then she nodded. "I think it might be higher than 95, she said. "I want to say that now. I'm not raising expectations I can't support. I'm saying the market for these things has continued to move. And this one has been missing for 50 years. He didn't say anything. She said, "I'll call you from the road." He watched her drive away. Then he went inside. He walked to the far corner of the carriage house. He stood in front of the tarp for a moment. The shape underneath was exactly what it had been since the day he walked in. Unchanged, patient, 50 years in a barn and still here. He didn't lift the tarp. He just looked at the shape of it. The proportions he had recognized from across the room on the first day. The specific curve of the rear haunches. The height. The weight of the line. He had spent his career finding things like this. Things that had been passed over because the person passing over them hadn't known how to look. He had given that career up for the right reasons. And now, when he needed it most, it had given him something back. He stood there for a minute in the cold. Then he went home. Rosie was at Frank and Carol's. He had the house to himself. He made a cup of coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. He thought about calling someone, but there wasn't anyone to call. Everyone who needed to know had been told. He sat in the quiet with his coffee and let the last few weeks settle. He had done what he could do. He had seen what he could see. He had found what was there to be found. Now it was simply a question of time. Otto had also authenticated the Duesenberg, which had been relatively straightforward. The chassis data on a Model J was well documented, and the car's presence in the Hartwell estate had a clear paper trail through the estate's own records. The 1957 Gullwing Mercedes had presented one question about a prior body restoration that Otto had resolved through factory records. The GT40 and the Cuda had been cleaner. Each car got its own documentation file. Renata's cataloging team arrived at Hartwell 10 days before the auction date and spent 3 full days building the records that would accompany each vehicle to its buyer. They were thorough and methodical and professional, and watching them work in the carriage house reminded Dean of his own years at the auction house in a way that was clean rather than painful. He had done that work. He had done it well. He had stepped away from it for the right reasons. Now it was being done for him, which was not something he had imagined when he had handed in his notice all those years ago in a conference room that cost more to furnish than he made in a year. He had not looked back. Not once. Not even now. He stood in the doorway of the carriage house on a Tuesday afternoon and watched Renata's team catalog a 1963 Ferrari 250 Gito that had been sitting in a Virginia barn for 50 years. And he thought about Rosie at school, probably working on fractions, and he thought, good, this is what it was for. The announcement went public on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after Renata had driven away from Hartwell. The auction house put it out through their official channels first. A press release, precise and spare. A barn find of extraordinary significance had been discovered in Rockbridge County, Virginia. Full authentication had been completed by 2 independent experts, including Dr. Otto Heiser. The collection included multiple highly significant vehicles. Headlining the collection, chassis 3987 GT. The 1963 Ferrari 250 GTO. The vehicle, lost from the collector record since 1974, had been located and authenticated and would be offered at private sealed auction in 90 days. By noon, it was the top story on every automotive publication in the world. By 3 in the afternoon, it was on the major news wires. By evening, the shop's phone had rung 40 times. Dean stopped answering after the 4th call. Frank handled the rest. Dean drove to pick Rosie up from school. He parked in the pickup line. He watched the doors open and the kids come out. He watched Rosie come down the steps with her backpack, scanning the cars for his truck. When she found it, she waved. Just once. The exact gesture he had seen her make 800 times. He waved back. She got in. She buckled her seatbelt. She said, "Did something happen?" He said, "Yeah." She said, "The cars?" He said, "Yeah." She looked at him with those careful eyes, her mother's eyes. "How much?" she said. He didn't have the final number yet. That would come at auction. But he had Renata's working estimate, revised upward twice in the past week as the scope of the collection fully registered. He had Otto's figure. He had a document from the auction house's financial team that laid out the expected range for each vehicle. The best estimate right now, he said, is somewhere between 95 and 110 million for the collection. The final number comes at auction. Rosie sat with that. She said, "That's enough for my surgery." He said, "Yeah, baby, that's enough for your surgery." She looked out the windshield at the school pickup line, moving slowly ahead of them. She said, "That's enough for a lot of surgeries." He said, "It is." She said, "We could help other kids." He had been thinking about that since the night Renata had told him the revised estimate. He had a number in his mind already. Not a complete plan, not yet, but a direction. "We can," he said, "if that's what we decide to do with it." He pulled forward. "That's a conversation we'll have, you and me, once it's real." She nodded. "Okay, then," she said, "Dad. When I had my first surgery, I don't remember it. Obviously, but you've told me about it." "Yeah," she said, "you were there the whole time." he said, the whole time. She reached over and put her hand on his arm. It was a small hand, 8 years old, with a friendship bracelet on the wrist that she'd made at school. She left it there for a moment. Then she took it back and looked out the window. He kept driving. He did not see Vivienne Cole for another 3 weeks. When he did, it was not at his shop. She had called Renata. He had expected she would. She had a long relationship with the auction house, and she had the resources and the connections to arrange what she arranged, which was a viewing of the collection before the sealed auction opened. It was standard procedure for buyers at this level. He could not object to it, and he did not try to. What he had not expected was that she would come to Hartwell herself, rather than sending representatives. She arrived at 9 in the morning on a clear, cold November day with 2 people, one of them the gray-suited man from the auction, and one of them a woman in jeans and a heavy sweater who turned out to be an automotive engineer from Stuttgart. Renata's team was already there. Otto was there. Frank was there, standing near the flatbed with his arms crossed, not saying much. Dean was inside when they arrived. He had been there since 7. He was standing near the far corner of the carriage house, with his back to the door when he heard footsteps on the stone floor. He turned around. Vivienne Cole was standing in the threshold of the carriage house. She was wearing a dark coat, same as the auction. Her 2 companions were behind her, but she was not looking at them. She was looking at the row of vehicles, some of the tarps removed now, the cars visible in the morning light. She looked at the Duesenberg first, then the Mercedes, its gullwing doors folded open, the GT40 beside it, the Porsche, the Cuda. She looked at each one for a long time. Then she looked at the far corner. The tarp was still on the Ferrari. Dean had left it covered, at Renata's suggestion, for the viewing, so the reveal could happen properly. Vivienne took a breath. She said, quietly to no one in particular, "How many of these are significant?" "All of them," Dean said. "Depending on your definition." She looked at him. He had thought about how this would go. He had thought about what he would say. He had thought about the moment at the auction, the gravel lot, her voice. Nothing significant. I had them appraised. He had decided, in thinking about it, that he was not going to make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He was a man who showed work. He walked to the far corner. He took hold of the edge of the tarp with both hands. He looked at Vivienne once. She held his gaze. He pulled the tarp away. The Ferrari 250 Gito was dark red. The paint had oxidized and dulled over 50 years in the barn, but the color was still unmistakable. The body lines were among the most specific in the history of automotive design. Every panel exactly where it was supposed to be. The proportions unchanged by restoration or accident. The car exactly as it had left the factory in Maranello in January of 1963. The grille was low and wide. The headlights curved into the front fenders in the specific way that was different from every car built before or after. The rear haunches swept back with a confidence that no restorer could replicate because it was not designed. It was understood. Built into the car by a man named Giotto Bizzarini, who knew things about aerodynamics that the rest of the industry was still learning. Vivienne stood very still. The woman from Stuttgart made a sound. A short, involuntary sound. The gray-suited man said nothing. Vivienne said, "What's the chassis number?" Otto Heiser stepped forward from the edge of the room. He said, 3987 GT. He handed her the authentication report, all 11 pages. She took it without looking at it. Her eyes were still on the car. She said, "When did it come to the Hartwells?" Otto said, 1974. Purchased through a Geneva intermediary. The documentation is complete. Every page from the factory to this carriage house. Vivienne looked at the report for the first time. She turned through the pages. She was reading carefully. Dean could see her reading carefully. She was the kind of person who always read carefully. He could see why someone like her could go wrong in the specific way she had gone wrong. She had read the appraisal 6 months ago, and the appraisal had been wrong, and she had trusted it because the person who wrote it had credentials. She had looked at the paper instead of the cars. She looked up from the report. She looked at Dean. She said, "The carriage house." I tried to claim the carriage house. Yes, he said. He said nothing else. He did not need to. She looked back at the Ferrari. She looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Nobody spoke. The morning light came through the open door and landed on the dusty red hood of the car, and in the quiet you could almost hear the 50 years it had spent here. "I was wrong," Vivienne said. It was not a small thing for her to say. He understood that. It was not something she said easily, probably. She had the look of someone who had spent a long time being right about things. But she said it plainly, not to perform it, just because it was true. She looked at him again. She said, "I looked at you at that auction. I looked at you, and I made a calculation." She paused. "I decided you didn't know what you were doing." He said, "I know." She said, "And I was wrong about that too." He said, "Yes." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked back at the car. Her expression was not easy to read exactly. It was something between professional loss and genuine awe. He had seen that expression before. He had felt it himself, the first time he walked into a room and found something no one expected to find. She said, "The auction. What's your floor?" He said, "You'll have to speak to Renata about the auction structure." He paused. "But I'll tell you this. The floor is fair." She said, "Is there a private sale option?" He said no. She looked at him. She said, "Why not?" "Because," he said, "it would need to go to auction to get the right number. Not the number she could offer him privately, which would be substantial. The number the open market would set, with every significant collector in the world bidding. And because, though he did not say this part, he wanted her to be in the room when it happened. He wanted the gavel to come down in front of everyone who had been in that gravel lot. She seemed to understand this without him saying it. "All right," she said. She handed the authentication report back to Otto. She looked at the collection once more. The whole room. All of it. The 5 significant vehicles and the 6 ordinary ones. Everything that had been in this carriage house for half a century. She said, "Mr. Marsh, I owe you an apology. I made a judgment in that parking lot, and I was wrong about it." She met his eyes. "I'm sorry." He looked at her. He thought about the legal letter in Patricia Ward's file. He thought about the cease and desist. He thought about the 4 weeks he had waited while Rosie went to school and Frank ran the shop, and he changed fan belts and brake pads and waited for the law to say what the truth already was. He said, "I appreciate that." She nodded once. She turned and walked out of the carriage house into the November morning. Dean stood alone in the carriage house for a moment. He looked at the Ferrari, at the 11 cars, at the morning light on the stone floor. Then he pulled out his phone and called Rosie's school to make sure she could stay at aftercare. He had a few things still to finish before he could pick her up. The woman from Stuttgart, the automotive engineer, walked the length of the carriage house slowly after the tarp came off. She did not touch anything. She moved as if the floor might not hold her weight. Careful, deliberate, she crouched beside the Ferrari's front wheel. She looked at the suspension geometry. She stood and moved to the rear. She looked at the fuel filler cap. She looked at the gearbox hump visible through the window glass. She said something in German to herself. Dean did not speak German, but he understood the tone. The gray-suited man from the auction had his phone out. He was taking photographs methodically. He had stopped pretending not to be affected. His hand was not quite steady. Otto was watching the room with the satisfied expression of a man who had spent 50 years waiting for exactly this kind of moment and had not been disappointed. Vivienne had not moved from where she stood. She was still looking at the car. Dean watched her. He had seen this before, not often, but a few times in his career. The way a serious collector looked at something they recognized as singular. It was not pleasure exactly. It was a kind of grief almost. The grief of beauty that you almost had, that was close enough to touch, that belonged to the world you lived in but would not be yours. She had spent 9 years and more money than most people would see in 100 lifetimes building a collection. She had eyes trained by that investment. She knew what she was looking at. And she knew she had told the man standing across the carriage house that there was nothing significant in these barns. Dean did not feel triumph about that. He had felt something like triumph in the weeks when the legal dispute was pending, when he lay in bed at night thinking about the letter and about Rosie's surgery number and about what it would mean to lose the car to a technicality. He had felt something close to anger then. Not a loud anger. The quiet kind. But looking at Vivienne Cole looking at the Ferrari, he felt only the clean satisfaction of a thing done correctly. He had seen the car. He had paid for it. He had documented it. He had been patient. Every step had been done the right way. The outcome was the right outcome. She said, without turning, "What are you going to do with it?" He said, "It goes to auction." She said, "The rest of them too?" He said, "The rest of them too." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The GT40 alone is worth $2 million. The Duesenberg might be more." She glanced at the Cuda in the corner, one of 14 Cuda convertibles ever built. She shook her head slightly. She looked back at the Ferrari. "And this one." He said, "Renata has the floor estimate." Vivienne said, "I know what the floor estimate is. I helped set the last Gito floor." She paused. That was in 2018. He said, "The market hasn't gone backward." No, she almost laughed. It has not gone backward. She took a step toward the Ferrari. Stopped, she looked at Dean. Said, "May I?" He nodded. She reached out and set one hand on the front fender. Very lightly. The way you touched something you understood was not yours and might never be yours. Her hand stayed there for a moment. Then she took it back. She said, "This is the most beautiful barn find I've seen in my professional life." She said it matter-of-factly, not performing, just saying what was true. And I was the one who looked at this barn and said nothing significant. He said, "You trusted your appraiser." She said, "Yes." He said, "That's not an unreasonable thing to do." She looked at him. He held her gaze. He was not forgiving her. That was not what was happening. What was happening was that he was a man who tried to be accurate, and being accurate meant saying the true thing. She had trusted someone who had made a mistake. That was a different thing from making the mistake herself. He was keeping the distinction. He thought she deserved to have it kept. She said, "I still tried to take it from you." The legal argument. He said, "Yeah." She said, "That was wrong." He said, "Yeah." Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she straightened. She said, in a slightly different voice, the professional voice returning, the shield coming back up, she said, "I'll be bidding on the GT40 and the Duesenberg. I want you to know that." He said, "That's between you and Renata." She said, "Of course." She turned toward the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. She said, without quite looking back, "Mr. Marsh, for what it's worth, I'm glad it's you." He said, "What?" She said, "I'm glad it was someone who knew what it was." She paused. Not everyone who finds something valuable understands what they've found. She walked out into the November morning. The gray-suited man followed. The woman from Stuttgart lingered an extra moment, looking at the collection once more, before she too walked out. Dean was alone in the carriage house. He looked at the Ferrari, at the other 10 cars, at the morning light on the stone floor, falling across 50 years of dust and waiting. He had paid $47,000. He had looked at something everyone else had walked past. He had waited, and he had been patient, and he had been right. That was the whole of it. No more complicated than that. The sealed auction ran over 3 days in January. Renata handled it from the auction house's main facility in New York. Dean was not there. He had offered to come. Renata had told him it wasn't necessary. The cars had already been transported, catalogued, photographed, and placed before the bidders. His job was done. The auction house's job was what came next. He and Rosie spent the 3 days at home. He worked half days at the shop. He made dinner every night. He helped Rosie with a project about the American Civil War that required building a model of something, and that they eventually decided would be a field hospital, which Rosie said was historically accurate and Dean agreed was probably fine. Renata called on the third evening. The Guido, she said. Final hammer price. $104,200,000. She paused. Dean. He said, yeah. She said, that's the highest price ever achieved for an automobile at auction. He said, okay. She said, the rest of the collection. She read him the numbers. The Mercedes, the GT40, the Porsche, the Cuda, the Duesenberg. She read each one in order, steady and precise. When she finished, she said, total collection, including the Gito, approximately $111,300,000. Before the house percentage. After fees, Dean, you're going to receive somewhere close to $94 million. He was sitting at the kitchen table. The dinner dishes were still there. Rosie's Civil War hospital project was pushed to one side. He could hear the television from her room, some nature documentary she'd been watching all week about migratory birds. He said, thank you, Renata. She said, don't thank me. You found it. He said, I know where it was. She said, don't be too modest about that. She paused. The story is going to be significant. The press will be calling. You should have someone handle that. I'll figure it out, he said. She said, and Dean. For what it's worth. There were 14 bidders on the Gito. From 8 countries. Nobody was thinking about what it cost you to find it. They were thinking about what it was. She paused. But I was thinking about it. He thanked her again. They said goodbye. He sat at the table for a long time. $94 million after fees. He thought about 47,000. He thought about the auctioneer's gavel and the gravel lot, and the woman in the dark coat walking past and saying nothing significant. He thought about 35 years of knowing how to read a car, the skill he had built and set down and carried quietly through every ordinary day of his ordinary life until the day it was needed. He thought about Rosie's surgery, 340,000. He had 94 million. The numbers did not fit comfortably in the same thought. He was not sure they ever would. He had decided what to do with most of it. He had been deciding quietly, for weeks, in the space between other thoughts. He had a lawyer. He had a financial advisor recommended by Patricia Ward. He had a plan. 340,000 for Rosie's surgery. A trust for Rosie's future. A donation to the Children's Cardiac Foundation that Dr. Reyes supported. One that would fund procedures for families who couldn't cover the gap between insurance and the actual cost. The rest into managed investments that he didn't have to think about, with Frank's future and Carol's future included. And the shop. He was keeping the shop. Frank had looked at him when Dean told him that. Frank had said, you could retire. Dean had said, I know. Frank had said, you're not going to retire. Dean had said, probably not. Frank had made a sound that was not quite a laugh and had gone back to work, and that was the end of the conversation. The appraiser who had told Vivienne Cole there was nothing significant at Hartwell Manor never made a public statement about it. He didn't need to. The story was in the press regardless. The details of the original appraisal, who had done it, for whom what they had concluded were part of the public record of the collection's discovery. He was not disgraced exactly, but he was not trusted at the level he had been before. In the collector world, trust was everything. He had missed something that Otto Heiser had found in a Monday morning. That was a fact that would follow him. Vivienne Cole had bid on the Guido. She had bid on it twice, steadily, before the number went past what her advisors had told her the ceiling should be. She did not push past the ceiling. That at least had always been one of her disciplines. She knew when to stop. The car went to a collector in Japan who had been looking for it for 12 years. Vivienne left the auction without the Ferrari she had wanted. She reached out to Dean 3 weeks after the auction. A brief email through his attorney's office. She said she had been thinking about what he had said in the carriage house. She said she was looking for someone with his skill set for a project she was developing. She said there was no pressure, and she understood if it wasn't something he was interested in. He read the email twice. Then he forwarded it to Frank with a note that said, "What do you think?" Frank replied, "Up to you." But she admitted she was wrong, which takes something. Dean wrote back to Vivienne. He said he appreciated the message and that he would think about it. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He left the door open because he had found in the past months that closed doors made worse neighbors than open ones. What he said yes to was the thing that mattered most. Dr. Reyes's office called with a procedure date in March. They would use a facility in Charlottesville. The surgery team was excellent. Dr. Reyes would be there. Dean would be there. The financial commitment had been made. He told Rosie on a Saturday morning, over eggs at the kitchen table. She listened to him explain it. The date, the hospital, the doctor, what the procedure involved in terms she could understand. She asked 3 questions. He answered all of them. She said, "And you have the money?" He said, "Yes, we do." She said, "From the cars." "From the cars." She nodded. She picked up her fork. She said, "Will it hurt?" "Probably some afterward," he said. "They'll give you medicine for it." She nodded again. She ate her eggs. She was quiet for a little while. Then she said, "Dad, I know you were scared." He said, "Yeah, I was." She said, "I was too, but I didn't want to say so." He said, "I know." She said, "I think it's okay to be scared when you love someone and you're trying to take care of them." He looked at her. He thought about what she cost him, in the best possible way. In the way that the things you love most cost you something, and you pay it without hesitating, and the pain is not the point but the proof. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." She reached across the table and put her hand over his for a moment. Then she took it back. She said, "Can we go to the park after breakfast?" He said, "Yeah, we can go to the park." They went to the park. The air was cold and clear, the kind of cold that made everything look exact. She ran ahead on the path and he walked behind her, watching her go. The leaves were gone. The trees were bare. The sky was the particular blue of a Virginia winter morning, with no clouds anywhere, and the light was the kind that made the world look like it had been decided on carefully. He walked with his hands in his pockets and watched his daughter run. She stopped at a bench near the pond and waited for him to catch up. He sat down beside her. She leaned against his arm. They looked at the water. A pair of ducks moved without urgency from one bank toward the other. He had $47,000, and he had spent them well. He had a skill he had carried for 20 years. He had used it at exactly the right moment. He had a daughter who was going to have her surgery in March, and who was leaning against his arm on a park bench in November, watching ducks. He did not need the story to be larger than it was. Rosie said, "Dad, those ducks look very calm." He said, "Yeah, they do." She said, "I want to be that calm someday." He put his arm around her. He said, "You've got time." The ducks reached the other bank and climbed out of the water without any hurry at all.